Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Afterlives of the Brontes. Now, this is the last video that I'm going to be doing because next week is our book club. We're going to be reading The Vanished Bride by Bella Ellis, so there won't be a video. Instead, we'll be having a discussion together based on our mutual reading of the book. This week, though, we're thinking about adaptations, particularly film and TV adaptations of two particular Bronte novels, Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Now, the reason I'm not going to be looking at all of the different novels and how they've been adapted is because there's simply so many adaptations that it would be too big a task to even try and cover Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights together in the same session, because those are the two books that have been most frequently adapted. I'm going to be bringing in Wuthering Heights today and over the course of this week. And also in the class, we'll be looking at The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and the one accessible TV adaptation that we have. And we're going to be thinking in relation to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, why there aren't that many adaptations and thinking about how we might go about adapting it. But we're going to be looking today at Wuthering Heights, and we're going to be looking at one specific aspect of adaptation. Now, we'll be looking at some others in the class, but today I want to think particularly about race and about Romani representation. So just a quick note before I get started today, I want to make a note about the language I'll be using. I'm going to be using Romani throughout, which refers to the people group originating in northern India that came to England in about the 15th or 16th centuries. They have historically been referred to as gypsies because of a misunderstanding about their origins and the idea that they came from Egypt. Now, that is a term that has been applied from outside to them, and it's often considered quite problematic within Romani communities today. Although in Britain, the British Romani community, Romani Charles, sometimes have used and sort of reclaimed the term gypsy, many of them, or some of them, continue to have problems with its usage, considering it a slur. And it is also considered to be a slur in North America, and the similar terms or equivalent terms are considered to be slurs in Europe as well, by and large. So I won't be using it. I'm not a member of the Romani community, so I don't have the right to use it. And I'd also ask you to think about your use of the term gypsy and to move away from it. The reason why it's been considered to be a slur is for multiple reasons. First, it's that imposition from outside. Second, because it's of its connotations with negative stereotypes. And third, because it has historically been used as a slur. It's also a term which has become a little bit unmoored from the people group within the modern context. As we'll be looking through the talk today, I'm going to give you the context in which the term was understood at the time, which is slightly different than today when it's come to be used a little bit vaguely about different traveling or nomadic groups. Although obviously each time it's used, it also refers to that original people group to who it is inevitably tied. So having given that introduction, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to be thinking about, particularly in today's talk. And that is the representation of Heathcliff on screen and a little bit as well on stage. And I'm going to be thinking about the way in which he has been racialized as Romani in the original book and on stage, or the ways in which race has been dealt with in adaptation. In order to do so, I'm going to be thinking about or talking about a range of different productions. All of these are from the UK or the US context. They're set in the 18th or 19th centuries, and they're set in the north of England. And they take the main body of the novel as their sort of starting point for their adaptation. It won't include necessarily all the novel. Many of these adaptations only focus on one generation, for example, but they are driven by or sticking to the novel to the extent that we can analyze them as similar texts. So, for example, we're not reading or looking at ones that are set in medieval Japan and massively change the original text. What I'm going to do is take you through a couple of common conceptions about Wuthering Heights, both the original novel and its adaptations, and kind of push back against some of the assumptions. Now, you may or may not know that in reference to the upcoming adaptation directed by Emerald Fennell, there's been quite a lot of pushback or controversy about a number of different aspects of the adaptation. One of which is the casting of a white actor in the role of Heathcliff, because, as I will be discussing, Heathcliff in the book is quite clearly racialized as a character of colour. Responses to this have been from the casting director is that, well, you really don't need to be accurate because it's just a book. Now, already we as Bronte fans might be going, oh, that doesn't feel right. But we can also theorize this. What does it mean to say that something is just a book? The idea is that, well, it's a work of fiction, so it doesn't need to be accurate as it would be to history. And that's true to a certain extent. But of course, a book is never just a book. It's also a reflection of the context in which it is created or which created it. And not only a reflection, it can also speak back to, it can also challenge the world which it created. Similarly, adaptations are going to be doing the same thing. They're going to be in conversation with the original book, its context, and their own context, the context in which the adaptation is produced or which produces the adaptation. One way I like to think about it is that an adaptation is always part of a dialogue. And the theorist Bakhtin talks about this idea of dialogism or the dialogue. And I think it's useful to use this framework to think about adaptation in some ways. He talks about every individual utterance or speech act, but I think we can use this to think about every individual adaptation. Is the link in the chain of verbal communication. It's all part of a dialogue, a conversation with the original text, with the context, and with the other adaptations as well. So that each adaptation, each utterance has definite boundaries defined by a change in director, a change in film, for example. But within these boundaries, the expression reflects a speech process, a dialogue, in other words, with that which has gone before, that which will come. So it reflects a speech process, a dialogue, others' utterances, and above all, every previous link in the chain. So when we're thinking about adaptations, we can't just view them as being neutral and created in a neutral space. We have to understand them as being part of a conversation with the world around them and with the original text and with the history of adaptation. So having thought about that basic claim and hopefully shown that we can't just think about books or adaptations neutrally, I want to go back to the book itself and think about the context which created it, and specifically how race is depicted in the text and how it's a reflection of its own particular context. So the idea that Heathcliff is a person of colour is something that many people push back on. And I've got this quotation from Christopher House from The Telegraph, thinking about the new film, where he says very confidently, Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights was not a person of colour. And he goes on to suggest that if Heathcliff is dark-haired and gypsy-like, could that not be achieved by hair dye and makeup? So just a quick note that I will be using the word in quotation to demonstrate its use. But also a quick note that what he's advocating for here is brown face, because Romani people are an ethnic group from India who are visibly different in many communities. Now, there's a great range of appearances across Europe and the world of Romani people, but there is often a visual difference. And this is something that you might note if you watch a lot of adaptations, because a lot of previous adaptations have taken on this guidance to use brown face. What I've put on the screen here are some demonstrations, some of which are suggestive, some of which I think are fairly conclusive, where you can see a picture of the actor playing Heathcliff alongside a contemporary picture of them, and where hair dye and makeup have been used to create a particular version of Heathcliff, and in some cases, some very dramatic wigs, as we see in the Ian McShane version. But is race something that is highlighted in the original text? Is Heathcliff white? Well, no, and there's a lot of evidence towards this as well. So there are numerous references to his dark skin. So when he first arrives, he's described as dark, as almost coming from the devil. He's compared by Nellie Dean to a regular black. Basically, she's saying, if you were smiling and happy, even if you were black, you could still be bonny. So my reading of this is the suggestion that he's not black, although he is a person of colour, although other critics have read this and suggested that it means that he is black or he has mixed race. The idea of this talk is not to give you one specific reading of Wuthering Heights, but rather to point to the ways in which different racial identities are pointed towards and drawn out, and how he is quite clearly racialized in the text. He's referred to as Black a number of times, but as you'll see, these are usually metaphorical. So a black villain, for example, or they're used, as it is here, this reference to his black countenance, in the same way that the term is used of other characters to show that their faces are blackened by emotion as well. So this is why I move away from reading him as a black man. But again, I'm not invested in that as a reading so much as showing his racialization. So other people that he's compared to is a little Lascar or a sailor from Asia, an American or Spanish castaway. Kathy speculates that perhaps his parents were Chinese and Indian. Heathcliff himself wishes that he had white features, a light hair and fair skin. And we also have Nellie's misrecognition of him when he returns as foreign because of his dark face and hair. Now, by far the most common term used about Heathcliff in this book is gypsy, referring to a Romani heritage, I would argue, particularly because he is so clearly racialized elsewhere in the novel as well. So these are just a couple of examples of the term being used and applied to him by a variety of characters throughout the novel. And specifically referenced in relation to darker skin, so dark skin gypsy aspect. Just a quick note here that the actor that you can see on the screen is the only actor, the only Romani actor to ever have played Heathcliff in a film production in a 2018 version that was not released, unfortunately. There are other things that point to this Romani identification in the novel as well, such as Isabella's recognition of him as looking like the son of a fortune teller, as fortune telling was specifically associated with the Romani community and was a traditional way of earning money. So we can see in this 1797 article that I'll look at in more detail later, for example, this association of Romani people with fortune telling, but also the idea of deceitful fortune telling. And again, at the end of the 19th century, the association with fortune telling is pulled out. We're also told that he speaks gibberish at one point, and Charles Leyland in the 19th century suggests that the term gibberish itself was first applied to the language of the Romani and may have been derived from sort of nicknames for or slurs for Romani people. Other contexts which might point to this Romani origin or this connection with Romani racialization, whether or not he is actually Romani, are contemporary reviews which refer to him as a, in inverted commas, gypsy. We also have Charlotte Bronte's own discussion of him, where she says Heathcliff exemplifies the effects which a life of continued injustice and hard usage may produce on a naturally perverse, vindictive, and inexorable disposition. Carefully trained and kindly treated, the black gypsy cub might possibly have been reared into a human being, but tyranny and ignorance made of him a mere demon. So here we have clear reference to him as a Romani person, or as a, in inverted commas, gypsy. This is racialized with a reference to him as black. And although there is a certain sympathy for him here, showing that he became who he was because of early ill treatment, there's also an idea of him as naturally, by his very nature, perverse and vindictive. And there's a dehumanizing language which compares him repeatedly to an animal, that he could have been carefully trained, that he could have been turned into a human being. And we're going to think a little bit more in a moment about the context that these authors, that the Brontes are writing in, and how they're reflecting contemporary understandings of Romani people and contemporary anti-Romani racism. I'd also sort of point to the fact that the Brontes were clearly interested in their other work as well on depictions of Romani people, and it's a group with which that they may have well encountered in different ways. So we have, for example, the fortune teller in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where we're told that a Romani woman has come to the house as a fortune teller. And we hear all of this in kind of fragments of speech until we hear the first full sentence about her is the magistrate saying, "Tell her she shall be put in the stocks if she does not take herself off." So we're getting perhaps an impression here already of how Romani identity and practices were criminalized at the time. She's further racialized by describing her as black, and she's associated with sorcery. Of course, as we all know, she's not real. This is not actually a Romani woman. It's instead Rochester, dressing up in the garb of a marginalized population, using his wealth and position to engage safely and in jest in a practice misrepresented by his actions and penalized by contemporary strictures. So he dons the clothes of a minority persecuted because of hateful stereotypes related to criminality and deceit, rather than, and as some critics have suggested, this triumphantly queering or overturning class and race and gender boundaries. I would argue that his appearance as a Romani woman, whose very identity is shown to be deceitful or a deceit, actually reinscribes pernicious stereotypes which contributed to the persecution of the community. Romani scholar Madeleine Potter has also suggested that the very uncertainty about his ethnicity in the text points towards a Romani identity, arguing that ambiguity is part of the racialization of Heathcliff as a Romani man, due to the fictional and factual insistence on uncanniness and mystery being part of a Romani identity, which unfortunately translates into public perception even today. So, having looked at the use of terms which apply to Romani identity in the book, I want to give you a bit of a context for understanding the history of the Romani in England and how they would have been understood at the time. It's quite important to understand, I think, the Romani if we're going to be dealing in Gothic literature at all, or the literature of the Brontes, because the Roma are a constant figure in Gothic literature from the 18th century onwards, and their depiction, including the depiction in Wuthering Heights, reflects long-held and often punitive stereotypes. The Romani arrived in England in the 16th century, in Wales in the 15th century, and they were quickly subjected to legal prosecution. The Egyptians' Acts of 1530 and 1554 were acts of total expulsion. In the Egyptians' Act, to be caught being a Romani in England, the first offence would lead to imprisonment, the second to confiscation of all your goods. It would also be the potential for branding. In 1554, the punishment was 2 years of enslavement, or indeed life enslavement if caught again. These acts were rescinded, and particularly the Second Egyptian Act was rescinded quite quickly, but Romani people continued to be legislated against either directly or indirectly, such as through the laws against vagabonds or nomadic peoples. Indeed, some laws like the 1744 Vagrancy Act referred directly to Romani people, criminalizing persons pretending to be and wandering in the habit of gypsies, also fortune tellers pretending to skill in physiognomy and palmistry. So they were directly targeting Romani communities here. We also have laws which refer to periods after the publication of this book, but offer us a useful context, which disproportionately affected Romani groups, such as the 1854 Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act in Scotland, which allowed vagrant children to be committed to industrial schools if they were considered likely to commit a crime in the future. Now, as Romani groups' very existence was often criminalized, this disproportionately affected Romani children, allowing hundreds, if not thousands of them to be stolen from their families and put into industrial schools. Enclosure acts and enclosure practices also removed common land upon which Romani groups could encamp. And we have rules like the trespass laws in Scotland acting as the root of modern day legislation, which continues to negatively affect nomadic Romani groups. A quick note here is that Romani people are not necessarily nomadic. There are lots of settled communities, both in England and in Europe more broadly. Indeed, some communities were forcibly settled, such as the Romani community in Romania, who were enslaved to chattel enslavement for centuries and forcibly settled. To give you an idea of how these laws are connected with a variety of negative stereotypes, which we see reflected over and over and over again in literature, it's worth going back to that 1530 Egyptians Act and its wording. It says that before this time, diverse and many outlandish people calling themselves Egyptians, again, a reference to that misunderstanding of where Romani people come from, that they, using no craft nor feat of merchandise, have come into this realm and gone from shire to shire and place to place in great company and use great subtle and crafty means to deceive the people, bearing them in hand that they by palmistry could tell men's and women's fortunes, and so many times by craft and subtlety have deceived the people of their money, and also have committed many heinous felonies and robberies to the great hurt and deceit of the people that they have come among. So we see here an association of Romani people immediately with laziness, craft, deceit, crime, and fortune-telling specifically. And again, this Egyptians Act led to enforced exile for the entire community, or an attempted exile of the entire community, imprisonment and confiscation of goods. Views of the Romani in England continue to repeat these stereotypes around Romani people. throughout the 18th and 19th centuries when Wuthering Heights was both set and written. So in the 1797 article, for example, we have a reference to Romani people as gypsies, an outlandish tribe of vagabonds who, disguising themselves in uncouth habits, smearing their faces and bodies and framing to themselves a canting language, wander up and down under pretense of telling fortunes, curing diseases, etc., abuse the common people, trick them or their money, and steal all they can come at. You might be already starting to find some uncomfortable resonances with Wuthering Heights here. One that I noticed recently is that reference to smearing dirt upon their faces. And if we think about the scene in which Heathcliff defies Cathy, says he wants to be dirty and rubs dirt on his face, there is an uncomfortable echo there. In the period in which the Brontes were writing, the origins of the Romani were becoming increasingly known and discussed, and there was a particular interest reflected in the newspapers of the time in Romani life and culture. The term gypsy was being used to refer explicitly to Roman people. And we see William Howlett, for example, writing about the true gypsies, in inverted commas, are readily distinguished by their jet black hair, black sparkling eyes, Indian complexions, and their genuine Oriental language. By the end of the 19th century, there was increasing interest in Romani people, and we have the setting up of the Gypsy Law Society, for example. This often takes an anthropological point of view, looking in from the outside and continuing to exoticize and sometimes perpetuate negative or incorrect stereotypes. So, for example, the idea that the Romani came from India is correct, but that they were of low caste has been shown to be incorrect by more recent historical research. Also, we see the repetition of negative stereotypes, such as they were unscrupulous thieves. So in a text that is, broadly speaking, more positive about the Roman people, we still get these particular stereotypes being repeated over and over again and applied to a whole ethnic community. In literature, there are two key ways in which the Romani have been depicted. Through demonization as criminals, as violent, for example, but also another major issue is exoticization. This can include the sexualization of women, such as Carmen in the opera, or Esmeralda, for example, in the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It also includes the romanticization of Romani men, and there are many romance novels, or novels such as D.H. Lawrence's The Virgin and the Gypsy, which exoticize or romanticize Romani men, making them not real people, but instead being a sort of representation of white female desire for freedom, absolutely ignoring the real conditions of Romani life in the period. As Royce Turner notes, the idea of the, in inverted commas, gypsy has been dichotomized between the romantic, mysterious figure imbued with psychic power, somebody who's often sexualized, romanticized, and exoticized on the one hand, and the thieving, scavenging, dirty brigand on the other. Literary texts involve the co-option of these popular Gadji narratives, Gadji meaning non-Romani narratives of gypsy culture, which, it must be stressed, but only the most tangential resemblance to the complex and heterogeneous lives of English gypsy travellers or Romani people throughout British history. So this is a production of an outsider's gaze, and I think you can see how Heathcliff can fit into both of those categories. In fact, he's certainly depicted as sort of criminal by nature, but there's also a romanticization of him, particularly through adaptations, that idea of the representation of a freedom or a wildness that is attractive. Again, not representing actual Romani people or Romani life or interested in doing so in any way. It's also worth noting when we're thinking about adaptations that this type of representation of the Romani, or indeed persecution of the Romani or anti-Romani racism, doesn't stop at the end of the 19th century, but continues up to the current day. A number of people have referred to it as what is often seen as the last acceptable form of racism. And by acceptable, I don't mean that it is acceptable, but rather that it is accepted by many people who would view themselves to be progressive. And we'll see some examples of that in a moment. But I just want to draw out sort of three axes of continued persecution or marginalization. First, legal discrimination, second, narrative stereotypes, and third, erasure. So legal discrimination continues, and I'll put the information up here so that you can stop and read it if you like. But it's worth drawing out how sort of spaces to which the Romani and other nomadic groups are able, how the spaces that they're able to use and encamp on have been gradually reduced with local government or local councils not fulfilling the requirements to provide space, for example. And laws like the 2022 Police Crime and Sentencing Act further criminalizing roadside living and nomadic lifestyles, threatening people with eviction, confiscation, criminal penalties, and being banned from an area for 12 months. You can imagine the effect that this has on access to things like education and healthcare, massive problems across nomadic communities, including the Romani community or the nomadic Romani communities. Racist stereotypes and betrayals also continue on both the right and the left. Lee Anderson, now a politician for reform, here references both types of sort of negative stereotyping. The exoticization of Romani people, making them not sexualized or romanticized here so much as sort of almost fairy tale creatures, playing the mandolin, flogging heather, and telling fortunes. And then we also have an example of the criminalization as well. But we also see these stereotypes appearing on the left. Royce Turner notes Labour MP Joe Ashton's 1991 reference to the Romani people, pitting them against the working class as though they could not or do not belong to the working class, saying that working class people have to live next to these gypsies with their generators going every night, with their horses, their health problems, their dogs, and their threats of violence. And I think you can start to see here, if you haven't seen it before, how that term gypsy rather than Romani is starting to be used increasingly negatively, or has always been used negatively, or as a slur. We also see these stereotypes having real world implications. When we had in the early 2000s and 1990s, for example, Romani refugees from the Balkans and Eastern Europe, due to the high rates of persecution and state repression there, that many of these families were branded as scavengers, as unreal refugees. We also have sort of stereotypes about the Romani stealing children having modern day consequences. In a number of countries, including in Ireland, Romani children who were essentially too white looking were taken from their families because they were believed to have been stolen, and only through DNA testing were they able to be brought back to their families. Another aspect of this kind of continued racism or anti-Romani racism is the erasure of Romani people through making them into a lifestyle, an aesthetic, or a culture, and completely ignoring the fact that this is a people group who has been subject to this historical marginalization and persecution. Erasure is a massive problem for the Romani community in a number of different ways. So in 1968, the Caravan Act actually essentially redefined the term gypsy, a term which has historically been applied to the Romani community, and erased any sort of racial identity connected to it, instead connecting it to a traveling lifestyle. We also have terms like GRT, Gypsy Roman Traveller, which can be useful in advocating for reform for shared concerns, but also end up with a conflation of ethnic minority groups with protected characteristics like the Romani, and cultural or lifestyle-based nomadic groups such as the New Age travellers. Another group of ethnic minority groups might be, for example, the Irish travellers. We also see how Romani people are often depicted specifically as white within government forms, ignoring the fact that most of them are a visual minority, something which has a massive impact, particularly on Romani communities in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, for example. And we see how erasure and negative stereotypes can come together in portrayals in films like Andrea Arnold's Fish Tank, where we have a group of travelers who are unidentified. It doesn't seem to be important to the narrative who they are, where they come from, or what group they might belong to. There are references to them coming from Wales, so that might refer to the Welsh Cale, which are a subgroup of the Romani, but there's no other evidence to suggest that. So that's a sort of erasure that we might be seeing, where the fact that there are different groups with different identities and different practices is completely erased. But we also see this association with negative stereotypes, as everyone in this encampment is shown to be connected to criminality, and many of them to animal cruelty and sexualized violence. So, just as a quick note, to put our depictions in Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre in context, I think it's worth pointing out how the Roma are depicted in the Gothic and how they become almost a stereotype, as a stereotypical presence in Gothic literature. So we have things like in Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, where we get Romani becomes essentially synonymous with banditti, and they're depicted as roving bands who plunder the traveller. In Matthew Lewis's The Monk, we have a wild Romani fortune teller who's associated with kind of sexualization and sexual iniquity of a sort, as her dress was composed of shreds of various coloured silks, and she danced in an eccentric attitude of folly and delirium, very much ignoring or erasing the actual purity laws within the Romani community and standards around dress and modesty. We also have her, the other sort of side of the equation, as the aunt of our main character refers to her as a gypsy, a sort of vagabond, a vagabond. That's the definition she gives of the term, whose sole occupation is to run about the country telling lies and pilfering from those who come by their money honestly. Out upon such vermin. If I were king of Spain, every one of them should be burnt alive who was found in my dominions after the next 2 weeks. In Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, we've already noted the presence of a supposed Roman woman. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Romani serve as servants of Dracula, and this has often been ignored by critics and readers. Indeed, there's a kind of common critical response to Dracula being with for another, and he's been read in the place of a persecuted minority, but this very much ignores the history of Romania itself, and particularly the history of chattel enslavement of the Roma and Romani from the 14th century to 1864. And Vlad Dracul, who Dracula is partly based on, enslaved well over 11 to 12,000 Romani people himself, and the number is probably higher with estimates as many as 15,000. We also have in Arthur Conan Doyle's The Speckled Band, for example, the association with the Romani being a mark of evil. The evil stepfather of the story, we're told, when he came home to this particular area, a terrible change came over him. And this is associated in part with his friendship with the wandering gypsies, the vagabonds to which he allows, where he allows encampment space. As Potter notes, over the course of history, the Roma become cultural caricatures that deny their real lives in the here and now. That's the context in which Wuthering Heights is written, and in which it uses the term gypsy over and over and over again. But let's move on to thinking about adaptation now I've given you this background. Well, there's this common idea that the interracial aspect of the novel's passionate romance wasn't addressed on screen until Andrea Arnold's 2011 adaptation, over 160 years after the book's publication. Now, I'll talk about the Andrea Arnold adaptation in the class, but this just isn't true. If we're thinking about casting actors of colour, which this seems to be saying is the only way that race could be addressed, we do already have that happening on stage in, for example, the 1994 and 1999 productions starring respectively Patrick Robinson and Chicks Obtain. But it's also worth noting that having an actor of colour play the role of Heathcliff is not the only way that race is addressed in productions. Now, that's not to say it's addressed well, or it's addressed responsibly, or it's addressed in a way that isn't, in some sense, anti-Roma or anti-Zionist, so racist against Romani people. But many of the adaptations, almost all of them, specifically identify Heathcliff as, in inverted commas, a gypsy or as Romani. Many of them specifically racializing him as well in the adaptations, either visually or through dialogue. And we have to encounter that and address that in order to think realistically and with nuance about the interactions between adaptation and race in reference to Wuthering Heights. I think it's interesting to look at a couple of reactions to these stage Heathcliffs because they give us an idea of many of the reactions that people have towards thinking about Heathcliff as a racialized person. In this article by Jerry Dempsey, he opens by saying a black Heathcliff, why not? Nobody jibes at a white Othello. Now, of course, this is said sarcastically, saying, of course, people would have problems with the white Othello. But here the assumption is, as we've already deconstructed, that Heathcliff is white in the novel, which is not. And it leads to comments like this, which are quite amusing in some ways, that the idea that it adds a racial dimension, that it takes on a new ugliness when you have lines like, I'm master here and don't you forget that gypsy, when very similar lines are actually in the original text, but are often ignored by both readers and adapters. Chicks Obtain's performance gets a very different reaction in this article by Eric Roberts, where we're told that he, as Heathcliff, looks the part, dark and imposing. But it also notes that he plays the character not as the archetypical romantic hero, but as the pitiless avenging devil treating the Lintons with object of contempt to crush beneath his foot and to verbally and physically abuse. Now, this would be indeed my reading of the novel to a great extent, but it's worth noting that the adaptations where Heathcliff is most rigorously racialized including the Andrea Arnold, where he's depicted as a black man. These are the adaptations where Heathcliff is most ruthless, most violent, and most vengeful. It's an interesting correlation. But let's have a look at the history of Heathcliff adaptations. Now, I'm not going to take us through every different one, but I'm going to pick out some case studies. And I'm also going to introduce you more broadly to the ways in which, as we can see from the very first adaptation, Heathcliff is almost always identified explicitly as a gypsy, or here a gypsy foundling. This is the 1920 version that I'll talk about more in our class. But here I wanted to give you an example of how the term is used across many different adaptations. And there's only a couple at the 1950 Charlton Heston that don't include this at all, that include this racialization or this use of the term. But he's referred to, and a content warning here for this being used very clearly as a slur, referred to as a rotten gypsy beggar, a beast of a gypsy, gypsy scum, gypsy filth, boorish gypsy, gypsy brat, filthy little gypsy, Earnshaw's gypsy, devil of a gypsy, dirty gypsy, and also a gypsy bastard. Over and over again, you see this term used as a slur very, very clearly, I would say. And there's two things that I want to pull out here. One is the fact that the repeated use of gypsy beggar refers to a stereotype about the Romani and begging, but also the fact that the term gypsy and filth or filthy are used together in so many different productions is particularly interesting because this arrangement of words does not occur in the original text. Instead, it reflects the linguistic climate in which the adaptations were made and points towards the continuing existence of these anti-Romani stereotypes and phrases. Now, I want to show the ways in which many of these productions very clearly imagine this Romani identity as racialized, and nowhere is this clearer than in the musical versions of Wuthering Heights, such as the 1997 Heathcliff starring Cliff Richard. We have this very upbeat song at the beginning called Gypsy Bundle, where Heathcliff is referred to many times as a gypsy bundle and double touch. And in the 1990s, he's referred to as a dirty, ragged, coloured breed. Language which was very much not accepted at the time, I would argue, and certainly wouldn't be accepted now. And it's also asked, could your own blood not provide you with the gratitude you need, showing that he's very much clearly an outsider, a racial outsider to the group. Now, this is a good example of a text which notes this racialization, but does nothing about it, does not question it, does not attempt to address it, but indeed just repeats these anti-Roma stereotypes and also kind of offers us a pro-colonialist text more broadly. If you've not seen the Heathcliff musical from 1997, apologies, we get an extended scene of Cliff Richard going to different countries and either tricking or murdering his way to wealth. So in an unidentified African country, he tricks the local populace into giving him money. In India, he kills the local ruler and takes the money. And then in China, he engages in the opium trade, essentially. As you can see from the pictures, there's yellow face and brown face that got used in these productions. And something that you might not be able to tell easily is that he also takes a person with him from each place, presumably enslaved. There's no other indication given. In the other Wuthering Heights musical from 1994, we have a song again that addresses this identity, does it with slightly more detail, but ends up falling into some of the same traps. It doesn't push back against anti-Romani sentiment at all, or it doesn't do so thoroughly. So it refers to, this is Kathy's song, where she's saying everybody calls him a vagabond and a scoundrel, a creature that no self-respecting woman would heed. So she's referring to these negative stereotypes, but then goes on to say the equivalent of, well, I'm colorblind, so my heart gives no recognition to distinction of color or creed, before going on to claim a gypsy identity for herself, again, erasing the idea of Romani as an ethnic identifier, instead viewing it as an idealized, romantic, wild lifestyle. So it's more the exoticization here than the criminalization, although that is clearly occurring with other characters in the text. Now, I want to pull out a couple of different case studies which seem to directly address more or less, with more or less screen time, the issue of Heathcliff's racialization as Romani. The first notable one for me is the 1967 television adaptation with Ian McShane, in which he is initially identified specifically as a gypsy brat, And that is associated with a racial identity through that term heathen as well, also if they do it, but being a non-Christian identity. And we have the rejection of him repeatedly by Hindley and the reference to Heathcliff using the term it. So it's that thing's fault. I'll not have it here. I'll not sleep with it. I'll not have it in the same room. And he is consistently referred to throughout the production as the gypsy by Hindley. I'd also suggest that he is meant to be visually racialized as well by the casting of Ian McShane. Now, he is not, to my knowledge, a member of the Romani community, but up until this point, his most famous role had been as a Romani man, as a Rom, Roybin in Skye West and Crooked. So there might be an attempt here to create visually a Romani identity, one analogy thereof. In the text, this Romani identity, as I've said, is highlighted in a number of different ways. When Hindley returns home, he asks Heathcliff, well, have the gypsies run away with your tongue, when Heathcliff doesn't say anything. And although this might suggest that he is moving away from suggesting that Heathcliff is a gypsy, we find out that this is just a prelude to an act of cruelty. Basically, what he says is, you have to leave or you stay as a servant. And then he gives him the Romani identity back. He explicitly calls him a gypsy again. That original question had been to sort of pretend that that wasn't the case, but then he makes clear that his position now in the family as a servant is directly related to him being a gypsy, as he calls him well gypsy. It's also worth noticing that he gives him the choice to stay or walk the roads, referring to the nomadic lifestyle associated with Romani people. An area where I think we see racialization being addressed to some extent by the production is when he's identified as a thief by Linton. He's identified as a thief when he's looked at by Linton, and the magistrate Linton identifies him as Romani, saying to Cathy, or asking why Cathy is scouring the country with a gypsy. And what we see here is that he's being depicted as a victim potentially of racial profiling. Now, although these lines are in the text, in the original novel, the way that they're performed, particularly the visual identification of Heathcliff before accusing him of thievery, and this instant recognition of him as a gypsy or as a Romani man, points towards this being an act of racial profiling. Heathcliff is very much depicted as a victim of prejudice throughout the first part of this televisual adaptation, including in that scene. And we do have a certain amount of sympathy for him before he becomes, in the second half, a particularly cruel and vengeful Heathcliff. Something that's interesting here and in the 2009 version, both of which interact with Heathcliff's racialization more directly, is it ends in suicide. So this is partly, could be seen as an act of agency, removing himself from the world which rejects him or rejecting the world violently himself. However, it's obviously an unsettling ending, the idea that there is no way for this Romani man to live in a white world without self-destruction. The 1970 version is an interesting one, specifically because it is one of the few adaptations to specifically deny that he is of Romani heritage, where we're told when he enters the room as a child that he is not a gypsy. Now, this is because this production leans into the idea that he's actually Mr. Earnshaw's child, so it leans into the incest plot, and specifically moves away from the implication of an interracial relationship at any level between Mr. Earnshaw and the woman or between Heathcliff and Cathy. It's one of the early, really highly romanticized and sexualized version with, as you can see in the images, an actual sex scene occurring between Heathcliff and Cathy. It's one of my favorite zoom outs in film because you get this close up with romantic music and romantic lighting of them kissing, and then you zoom out and they're just sort of rolling around in the dry grass behind a twig. We have this constant reference to him, we have a reference to him as a gypsy from other characters, but this is not the constant referencing that we get in other texts, and it's seen to be an assumption which the family does not hold, instead allowing him to be called that as part of the blind about his actual parentage. The text indeed is haunted by both incest and illegitimacy, which is the main kind of taboo which it's exploring or breaking. Because they've slept together, we don't know who is the father of Cathy's child. And we hear that Heathcliff is waiting to see the colour of his eyes. So there's this emphasis on eyes and identification through eyes. So when we return at the end of the film to eyes, it has a loaded meaning. as Heathcliff returns to Wuthering Heights right at the end of the film, he sees a vision of Cathy as a ghost coming towards him and has this moment of revelation where he realizes that her eyes are exactly the same as his. And he dies in this moment of realization, shot by Hindley, seemingly sort of an act of providential vengeance against this taboo breaking. However, he does get to join her in death, something that also happens in the 1967 and the 2009 version, all of which imagine an afterlife for Heathcliff and Cathy despite the taboos being broken. 1998 also addresses the racialization of Heathcliff in some interesting ways. He's described as a filthy little gypsy and as gibbering like a monkey, so referring to lines in the text, but making them much stronger in effect and more clearly linking them with racialization or with the use of gypsy as a slur. But also made clear that his skin color is meant to be not white, as Hindley mocks him and saying, you can scrub for all your worth, but you won't get the darkness out of your skin. The number of places that he could come from is widened out. In the original, there's a speculation that maybe he's from China or India, or that his parentage is. But in the discussion with Cathy here, it includes Africa, Spain, Egypt, and Paradise. Egypt perhaps being a reference to Romani heritage and that misconception of where Romani people come from. But we also have this unfortunate kind of echoing of the fortunate fall idea that wherever he's from, this is now his paradise. What we see in this adaptation is Heathcliff as a Romani man depicted as being connected with some of the stereotypes, the anti-Romani stereotypes. So child Heathcliff makes weapons in their castle, the cave that he and Cathy share, to kill anyone who take you from me. So here, his violent tendencies are emphasized even from youth, and they're emphasized through the film. And this is one of the few editions in which he hangs the dog, another one being the Andrea Arnold version. We also have, Cathy asking, well, who would try to take me from you? And he says, evil spirits. So you also have this tendency towards magical belief. Again, another sort of association with the stereotypes about Romani characteristics. It doesn't just, however, repeat these negative characteristics, it tries to do something else as well. In the second half of the film, we get a kind of detailed study of Heathcliff's psychological breakdown. And this is partly the psychological breakdown of a man trapped in a white world which doesn't accept him. And it's something that's quite interesting about this adaptation is that he explicitly blames the world around him, its structures, and it's the way that it functions for destroying both him and Cathy. So instead of directing his ire against Cathy in this version, when she dies, when then finally Edgar Linton dies, he takes his rage out against the Grange, destroying one of the rooms. So attacking what he views as a symbol of the structures that are controlling the world in which he lives in as an originally working class and also Romani man. Again, he gets to rejoin Cathy in death in this version, worth noting. One of the ones that does the most to explore Heathcliff's Romani identity is arguably The Wuthering Heights from 2009, starring Tom Hardy. Now, there was complaints at the time about him being cast as a white man, and I don't disagree with that. What I would argue is sometimes happening in this text, though, is the attempt to depict him as a white passing Romani man. He's identified right from the beginning as a gypsy, but that is identified with specific behaviors as well. And the Hindley says here explicitly that we have to show him his place or he'll kill us all in our beds. So the idea of his Romani identity being connected to his place in society and also predicted violent behaviors. He's referred to as a cuckoo throughout this particular production, which is interesting based on the time in which it was created and the kind of external to the film discourses around Romani immigrants and refugees, for example, the idea of them as benefit scroungers or coming in without necessary cause, where of course we actually know about the persecution of Romani people in the Balkans and Eastern Europe necessitated them arriving as refugees. So there is this kind of interesting, perhaps, reflection on external discourse, or discourse external to the film. What we find is that consistently he's identified as Romani not because of how he looks, but because of how he acts. In his youth, he's picked on, and because he's identified as a bastard, not because he looks Romani, which some of the different adaptations take on. But he's then recognized by others as Romani through his behavior. So, for example, at a fair, he makes a good deal on a horse, and a horse seller says he has a touch of the gypsy. which leads to him having a sort of emotional breakdown and self-questioning about his identity. And he asks Cathy, where do you think I began? She replies with customary solipsism, you began in here, I jumped you up. And of course, this reflects Cathy's own sort of almost narcissism or selfishness or her sort of self-involvement. But we could also see it as being a bit of a reflection on the ways in which Romani people, as they exist, or as they exist as gypsies in text and in popular imagination, is dreamt up by the white imagination. Anyway, he goes on to say the horse trader sensed my wretched origins. And we have this idea then throughout that's developed that what he understands about his heritage is that it's Romani, but that is a dark heritage. And he takes these ideas from the world around him, the world that has shaped him. The revelation of his identity occurs in this film on the same day that Mr. Earnshaw dies, and he draws out a thread of causality between these two things, reinforcing this idea of a dark heritage. He explores this, in inverted commas, dark heritage in a number of ways, including cursing Hindley or trying to put a curse on Hindley and being glad of Francis's death. It suggests that he believes in the causality of his curse, but more importantly, it also points to the ways in which he tries to live up to his own concept of his heritage. Other people also recognize him as sort of associated with Romani heritage and try to put on him different stereotypes or deliberately move away from them. So when he returns rich, Isabella said, we haven't got all of that money simply by trading horses and reading fortunes, traditional Romani trades. And so he disassociates himself from these common stereotypes, which are true, these are Romani traits, instead pointing towards and identifying himself with more negative stereotypes around Romani people, saying that he made money by taking advantage of other men's weaknesses, those ideas that we saw of the Romani being connected with deceit, cheating, and criminal activity. And then we see him in real time, well, not real time, but in almost real time in this adaptation, ruining Hindley deliberately and ruthlessly on screen, something that doesn't often happen in adaptations. So reinforcing this idea of the negative origins of his wealth. I would say that he continues to wrestle with his identity throughout this production. And we see him saying after his return to Cathy that, everything has changed in me except one. And I could change that. If I could change that too, I would do so. Now, judging on the fact that he's having a conversation with Cathy at this time, we could see this simply about his love for Cathy. But I'd also like to suggest that there's also the possibility that it's about this sense of his own dark heritage, something that which comes out in conversations with other characters, including Isabella. Now, they have a more equal relationship in this film than in any other, and they talk to each other somewhat more freely, at least before their marriage. And she goes out to see him on the top of Windy Hill, and he asks, well, why are you coming to see me when everybody else hates me, when everybody else only sees bad in me? Again, referring to that sort of sense of that wretched inheritance. And she says, well, perhaps I'm attracted to the bad of you. And the face that you can see on the screen is the face he pulls at that. He's particularly shocked by that idea, the idea that the attraction to him, isn't because she sees past the stereotypes, but because she enjoys them. And he says, no, do not make a joke of it. A person who sees the good in me as a sensation I experience so rarely that it is enough to make me at least try to love you. So we see here him referring both to the reception he meets in the world, but also perhaps the sense that he has of himself, something that Isabella picks up on. I knew you were a man who presented a darkness to the world because that is what protected you best, and I know your soul must be in torment for you to believe such a thing. Now, Isabella is shown in this adaptation to be right in the supposition, but not, of course, in her supposition that she can save him through marriage. And we see Heathcliff imbibing these particular ideas of himself and his own darkness. And he only breaks with those really towards the end of the production, when he's confronted by Hindley after Cathy's death. Because the other person who has consistently viewed Heathcliff as having this dark heritage is Hindley. And when he sees Heathcliff's grief, he says to him, you can't be real. It's no more real than the clothes you're wearing making you a rich man or a gentleman, because you are nothing more than a gypsy bastard, and so your love can only be pretend love, and your grief for her a pretend. And he's cut off quite violently by Heathcliff. But what we see happening in this scene is this idea of him being at his heart, always having this secret, always having this identity that means something specific, that means a sort of dark heritage. because he doesn't believe Hindley about his love for Cathy, because he knows he loves Cathy, because he can't believe Hindley about that, he no longer listens to Hindley about his Romani identity as well. And we see him more clearly accepting his Romani identity here, or his identity as an inverted commas gypsy. But what this leads to in the end, as in the 1966 version, is actually Heathcliff's suicide, as he takes himself out of the way of the younger generation. But also we see this sense of the inability of a Romani or a gypsy man, as he's defined in this edition, in this adaptation, to live in this white world, essentially, which he's been struggling with for his entire life. Now, just to finish up, and I know this has been a long one, guys, but there's a lot of kind of complicated stuff to go through. I want to briefly talk about sexualizing and romanticizing Heathcliff, because there's an interesting history of this in relation to race. The idea that Heathcliff is a romantic or a sexual hero is something that comes about, I would argue, through adaptation. Emerald Fennell, in talking about her decision to cast a white man as Heathcliff, says that she did it because when she saw Elodie with the Heathcliff look, she wanted to scream. And he reminded her of the illustration of Heathcliff on the first book that I read. Now, to me, this is quite a revealing statement. Firstly, it shows that the casting is based on sexual or romantic attraction to the actor itself, or is connected to that sense of he is sexy, he is attractive. That's part of why he's Heathcliff. But also this unquestioned sense of, well, it's because he looks like this illustration, without thinking about where that illustration of a sexy Heathcliff comes from, what the history of it might be, and what the history, how we get from some of those original pictures of Heathcliff that I showed, where he's depicted as having almost animalistic features, to the current imagination of him as this attractive man. Well, what I want to suggest is that we see a really key point happening in 1939, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the class as well in relation to Wuthering Heights' romance. What we see happening in 1939 is a move to view the story of Wuthering Heights as a romance, something which we weren't really seeing before. And it's also the time when we see Heathcliff become sexy. And I think you can possibly see why, if you see the Laurence Olivier picture there with his shirt open, looking very troubled. But it's also explicitly where the whiteness of this onstage presentation becomes part of that romanticization. As I mentioned, the adaptations that lean most into racialization and where he's depicted as being a man of color are the ones that lean most into violence and away from romance. What we see in the 1939 one is a really interesting relationship to Heathcliff's Romani identity. So he's referred to as a gypsy beggar throughout the film, but this reference to him as a gypsy beggar conflates a racial identity with contemporary stereotypes of begging and thievery. So what we get is a racialized insult, which is defanged, well, not defanged, but is removed from that kind of racial emphasis, and which conflates identity with behavior and status. And we see this idea of gypsiness or Romaniness being disassociated from Romani as an ethnic identity and attached to a sort of lifestyle or behavior code that can be passed on or infectious, as we see with Edgar Linton's comment to Cathy that some of that gypsy soul has got into you, some of that beggar's dirt has got onto you. So this idea that Cathy's behavior is like Heathcliff's, therefore she too is an inverted commas gypsy. We see some engagement with the idea of a gypsy identity or a Romani identity as racialized, I think, in Heathcliff's conversation with Isabella at a ball at the Linton house, where she asks him if he would like to waltz, and he says, no, that's how the gypsies dance. I'm surprised to see you such abandoned ways creep into so fine a house. Although this might seem to distance him from the Romani people, we can very much see this as a barbed or double-edged comment, where he is the one who is creeping into such a fine house. He is the one infiltrating it. He is the Romani man. He is like the Romani dance. And we see Isabella say, yes, father used to say it undermined the whole of society and turned us all into profligates. So this idea of the rejection of kind of Romani ways of life, Romani identity, and a foreshadowing of what Heathcliff will be bringing to the house of Linton, i.e. ruin. But I think what we what we ultimately see is this idea of gypsy becoming disassociated from racial identity and attached to behaviours. So Cathy refers to herself as losing her gypsy ways, where Romani identity and behaviours become conflated, and which conversely opens up a space for the erasure of the racialized nature of the identification, as we see here. And then, although we have, as I've noted, some adaptations which focus on that racialization or pull aspects of it out, others use the gypsy and the slur associated in ways in which it is used in contemporary society without actually trying to investigate that as an ethnic identity. And we see that that adaptation becomes a yardstick for future adaptations. It's referred to again and again and again, and it's been referred to in the news this year in reference to the Emerald Fennel take. It's interesting, as I noted, to show which adaptations veer from it or want to separate themselves from it. In the 1967, where Heathcliff is more clearly racialized, wants to move away from it and specifically remove the sentimental tripe. But we continue to see it also being referred to in the more romantic versions as the kind of example of what Wuthering Heights could be. So I just want to leave you with these considerations, thinking about how Heathcliff, Cathy, romance and Romani identity come together, because the Romani identity of Heathcliff becomes both absent and present in many of these adaptations. It's tied to, or the idea of him being Romani is tied to this idea of freedom or wildness that Cathy is attracted to, but it's also made invisible by the casting of frequently white actors. So he becomes both Romani and not Romani at the same time, and an acceptable sort of object of white female desire. What I've been asked before, and what I would say again, is, well, how do we address this in adaptation? How do we interact with the convoluted and complex nature of racial identity as it appears in the novel and push back against the anti-Romani racism or anti-Romani stereotypes that have appeared not only in the novel but in many adaptations? I'd say that we need to foreground Romani opinions in the making of these productions with Romani actors, directors, and writers, rather than just continuing to repeat the same tropes and the same white gaze on a character who is one of the most famous gypsy characters or Romani characters in English literature. So I'll leave you with that and some thoughts. What I'd recommend doing this week is to have a look at one or more adaptations, noting yourself how particularly it deals with questions of Romani identity or of race more broadly. And I'll see you in class.